In the gray light of an April morning in 1952, three men in faded overalls stood at a split-rail fence and laughed until their shoulders shook. Below them, in 6 inches of black Indiana mud, a 19-year-old girl kept pushing bare gray sticks into the flooded ground without looking up. Her name was Elowen, and she had inherited 40 acres the bank was already itching to take away from her. In her grandmother's attic, she had found 200 dead-looking cuttings wrapped in oilcloth tied with twine, so old it crumbled at the touch. Her own father turned his back on the flooded field that evening and walked to his truck without a word. The county extension agent wrote her a formal warning that everything she was doing violated modern agricultural science. Then a long, dark Packard rolled up to the pasture gate, and the wealthiest man in Mercer County stepped out and went white as skimmed milk at the sight of her field. 6 months later, that same county would be lined up at her fence in the middle of a killing drought, begging for the secret of a woman who had once talked to plants. They stood at the fence line in the gray light of an April morning, three men in faded overalls and dusty caps, their faces burned brown by decades of merciless sun on flat Indiana ground. They laughed until their bellies shook and their eyes watered. They laughed because Elowen was 19 years old, barely 5'2", with hands that had never known the proper weight of a plow, and she was out there in the flooded bottomland behind her grandmother's old house, pushing bare twigs into 6 inches of black mud and brown water. 200 sticks, 200 dead leafless, lifeless sticks that she had pulled from a rotting bundle in her grandmother's attic tied with twine, so old it crumbled at the touch. The men from the co-op shook their heads. Her own father turned his back and walked away without a word. The county extension agent, a thin man named Edgar Pembroke, who wore thick glasses and carried a clipboard, like it was a badge of office, actually wrote her a formal warning that planting in flood conditions violated every agricultural principle known to modern science. Elowen kept planting. She planted until her fingers were numb and her back screamed until the rain mixed with the tears on her face so no one could tell the difference. She planted because she had nowhere else to go, nothing else to lose, because the note tucked inside that rotting bundle had said simply, "Plant these in the mud when the creek rises. Trust the water." 6 months later, the whole county would come begging for her secret. But to understand why a teenage girl would risk everything on a bundle of dead sticks, you have to understand what she had already lost. You have to understand Mercer County in the spring of 1952, when the rains came and would not stop, when the Wabash River swelled its banks and swallowed cornfields whole, when the clay soil turned to soup, and the farmers watched their livelihoods dissolve into brown water and quieter kinds of despair. You have to understand that Elowen's grandmother, Cordelia Whitaker, whom everyone in the county had called Della for 60 years, had died 3 months earlier on a cold February morning, leaving behind 40 acres of bottomland that the bank was itching to repossess. A farmhouse with a sagging porch, a leaking roof, and a reputation as the home of a woman who talked to plants and believed in old country nonsense. Inside rested a bronze medal on a faded ribbon, tarnished green at the edges, stamped with the eagle of the American Expeditionary Forces. Beside it, a photograph the size of a postcard curling at the corners. Two young men in doughboy uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder against a wall of stacked crates, their caps tilted at identical angles. Her grandfather Thomas she recognized at once from the wedding portrait downstairs, his jaw set the same way, his eyes the same pale gray as her own. The other soldier she did not know. His face had been struck through with a hard diagonal line of pencil drawn so heavily that the graphite had bitten into the paper. Elowen carried the tin box downstairs in her apron pocket. She set the photograph on the kitchen table beside a cold cup of coffee and studied the pencil mark for a long time. Someone had wanted that face erased. Her grandmother, most likely though. Della had never once spoken to Elowen about the war, about the man who came home in a pine box before her son Alden had been born. The girl who had grown up eating pie in this kitchen had never thought to ask. Now the ash of an old grief seemed to stir beneath the table, warmer than the wood stove, older than the house. She tucked the metal back into the tin. She tucked the photograph beside it. The sticks she carried out to the back porch where she filled her grandmother's old galvanized wash tub with rainwater from the cistern, dropped the bundle in, weighted them down with a fieldstone, watched them settle into the dark like drowned bones. The next morning she carried the empty bundle down to the bottom field, the 40 acres her grandfather had always called the drowned land. It lay at the lowest point on the property where Miller's Creek curved in a lazy bend before joining the Wabash 2 miles south. Every spring that field flooded. Every summer when the waters receded, it turned to baked clay, cracked like a jigsaw puzzle. Nothing grew there but swamp grass and mosquitoes. Her grandfather had tried corn once years before Elowen was born, lost the entire crop to rot. He had fenced it off and used it for nothing but grazing their old mule Betsy, who had died the same winter as Della, as though the beast had known there was no one left to feed her sugar cubes on Sunday mornings. That March, the drowned land was living up to its name. Miller's Creek had overflowed its banks 2 weeks earlier. The field was a shallow lake of brown water shot through with the silhouettes of last year's cattails. The standing water came halfway up Elowen's rubber boots as she waded out on the third morning with the first armful of soaked cuttings. She had no plan, no grid, no measuring tape. She simply walked the field, feeling her way by instinct, pushing the sticks roughly 6 feet apart in rows that wandered because she had no way to lay a straight line in the murk. The mud was cold even through the rubber. The water smelled of decay and minerals, and something else, something green and waiting, though she could not have said what. She planted until her arms ached, until the sun crossed the sky and dipped toward the tree line, until she had placed all 200 sticks in the mud, stood back to look at her work. From a distance, it looked like nothing. 200 twigs poking from a flooded field barely visible above the waterline. It looked like debris. It looked like a mistake. It looked, as her father would say later that evening, when he drove out from town, like the work of a girl who had lost her mind in her grief. Alden Whitaker had not wanted his daughter to take the farm. He had wanted her to sell it to use the money for teachers' college in Indianapolis, to make a life away from the soil that had broken his own father and his father's father. Alden worked at the grain elevator on the far side of the tracks, a job with steady pay and clean hands. He had spent 20 years trying to escape the uncertainty of farming, 20 years trying to convince himself that a paycheck every other Friday was worth more than any acreage of hope. He stood at the edge of the drowned land that evening, his good shoes sinking slightly in the soft ground where the field met the pasture, his coat collar turned up against a wind that came off the water carrying the smell of rot. He looked at the sticks. He looked at his daughter. His face crumpled with a mixture of pity, rage, love wounds so tight around itself that it looked like fury. Elowen stood in the field, her dress hemmed dark with mud, her hair plastered to her forehead by mist and sweat. Alden's voice came out flat as a cast-iron pan. "Elowen, what have you done?" She didn't answer at once. She kept her fingers on the last stick, pressing it a little deeper, as though the answer lived in the earth beneath her palm. "Grandmother left me instructions, Pa. She left me the sticks. She said to plant them in the mud." Alden rubbed the back of his neck. "Your grandmother was a good woman, but she had ideas, old ideas, country nonsense that a girl your age ought to have grown out of by now. Those sticks are dead, Elowen. Look at them. They're dead wood. You cannot plant dead wood in standing water and expect anything but rot. Then they'll rot." Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "But I'll have tried, I'll have done something instead of sitting in that house waiting for the bank to take it all." He rubbed his face with both hands. He looked older than his 42 years, worn down by worry and by the specific weight of a widower who had already buried too many people. "The bank man is coming next Tuesday, Mr. Hollister from First Mercantile. He's going to want to walk the property, assess the land value. If he sees this mess out here, he's going to think you're not fit to manage the estate. He'll push for immediate sale, and there won't be a thing I can do to stop him. Then let him see it. Let him see everything." Her father stared at her for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw something worse than anger. She saw the death of hope. He had never believed, not the way her grandmother had believed, not in the way that made things grow against all odds. He believed in the elevator, the paycheck, the solid ground of certainty. Looking at his daughter standing in a swamp with dead sticks in her hands, he saw only the certainty of another failure with the Whitaker name on it. "You're just like her." It did not sound like a compliment. "God help you, girl, you're just like her." He turned and walked back to his truck. He did not visit again for 3 weeks. Her father's disapproval was only the beginning. Word travels fast in Mercer County, carried on the wind that blows across flat fields and through screen doors left open against the coming spring. By the end of that first week, everyone in a 15-mile radius knew what Elowen Whitaker had done. The farmers at the Grange Hall had opinions. The ladies at the Methodist quilting circle had opinions. Even the children at the schoolhouse where Elowen had once substitute taught had opinions repeated verbatim from their fathers over the supper table. Edgar Pembroke, the county extension agent, drove out on a Tuesday morning in his government-issue Ford clipboard at the ready. He was the sort of man who measured success in bushels per acre, believed that anything not printed in the university bulletin was probably fraud or hex. He waded into the field in his rubber boots, examined one of the sticks with a magnifying glass. On a brass chain made his notes weighted back. Miss Whitaker, these appear to be Salix alba cuttings, white willow, possibly an old ornamental variety. They show no signs of viable cambium activity. The bark is desiccated, the nodes are dormant. Planting in anaerobic conditions like this in standing water with no drainage, you're looking at total necrosis inside of 2 weeks. Even if the cuttings were viable, this soil, he consulted his clipboard, this soil is heavy alluvial clay with poor percolation. It's the worst possible medium for root establishment. Elowen tilted her head. She did not raise her voice. My grandmother grew roses in this soil, Mr. Pembroke. Roses that took the blue ribbon at the state fair 3 years running. Roses are not willows. Prize roses on high ground are not 40 acres of bottomland underwater. I'm advising you officially to remove these cuttings before they become a vector for fungal infection. If you won't do it for the health of your own property, do it for the county. We cannot have diseased plant material compromising the watershed. I'll take that under consideration. She had no intention of removing a single stick. Pembroke left shaking his head, muttering something about the tragedy of inherited ignorance, loud enough for her to hear on the wind. The truck had not been gone 5 minutes when the second vehicle appeared at the top of the lane. A long, dark Packard waxed to a mirror finish that threw the noon sky back at itself. It rolled to a stop at the pasture gate. The driver's door opened. The man who unfolded from it was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a wool suit too fine for a Tuesday in mud season. Silas Ashford owned more acreage than any other man in Mercer County, sat on the board of First Mercantile Bank, kept a pew at the front of the Methodist church that nobody else dared to fill. Elowen knew him by reputation only. She had never spoken a word to him in her life. She watched him walk to the fence line, watched him lean both gloved hands on the top rail, watched him look out across the drowned land at the 200 sticks that broke the surface of the water, like the fingers of the buried reaching for air. He did not laugh. He did not smile. His face went the color of skimmed milk. His mouth opened, once closed opened again, as though he had swallowed something with a bone in it. She raised her hand in greeting, unsure what else to do. Silas Ashford did not return the gesture. He stood at that fence for a full minute, staring at the field, staring at her, staring at some point over her shoulder as though a third person stood there, whom only he could see. Then he turned, walked back to the Packard, drove away without a word. The dust from his tires hung in the lane for a long time after the engine noise had faded. Elowen stood in the mud with a cutting still in her hand, feeling the wet cold of it against her palm, feeling something colder settle in her belly. She had seen fear on the face of an old man. She could not think of a single reason why a stranger of his standing should be afraid of her. That night she lay in her grandmother's iron bed, listened to the house settle around her, tried to make sense of what she had seen. The rain started again around midnight, a soft, patient rain that would go on for days. She heard it on the tin roof over the back porch, on the shingles of the parlor, on the leaves of the sycamore that leaned over the kitchen window. She thought of the 200 sticks out there in the dark, alone in the water. She thought of her grandmother's note. She thought of Silas Ashford's white face. Sleep, when it came, brought a dream of her grandfather Thomas, standing in the drowned land, in a doughboy uniform, water up to his knees, holding out his hand for something she could not see. April opened its full weight on Mercer County the next week. The Wabash rose again. Miller's Creek swallowed the bottom field so completely that only the very tops of the sticks remained visible above the waterline, like the masts of a sunken fleet after some slow disaster. Elowen walked the perimeter of the property every morning at first light in rubber boots 2 sizes too big, an oilskin slicker of her grandfather's that dragged her shoulders into a stoop. She watched the water. She talked to the sticks in a low voice that she would have died before letting anyone hear. She fought the despair that crept into her chest every evening when the light failed and the house creaked with loneliness. She had no money for groceries beyond what she could grow in the kitchen garden, what her neighbor Ruth Calloway brought over in exchange for help with the chickens. She spent her days repairing the farmhouse, patching the roof with tar paper and stubbornness, painting the porch steps a bright cornflower blue that her grandmother had loved. Ruth Calloway lived a half-mile down the county road in a white clapboard house with green shutters, ran a flock of Rhode Island Reds that laid brown eggs the color of the good earth. She was 55 years old, widowed, 9 years, built like a fence post, but softer around the eyes than most women who had buried a husband and buried a son besides. She came up the lane on foot the second Tuesday of April, a basket over one arm, a shawl pulled tight against the wet. She found Elowen on the porch mending a screen door with a length of copper wire. "I brought you 6 eggs and a jar of my June pickles. Don't argue. You look like a broom handle in a dress." She set the basket down on the top step, sank onto the second one with a sigh that had weight in it. "I've been meaning to come by. Meaning is a poor substitute for doing. Your grandmother taught me that." Elowen sat down beside her, wire still in one hand. "You knew her well. Everybody knew Della. Not everybody understood her. Different animal understanding." The rain had stopped for a spell. A cardinal called from the sycamore. Ruth watched the cardinal for a moment before she went on. "I want to tell you a thing, child, because I don't know how much time either of us has for telling anymore. Your grandmother saved my rose bed 15 years back. Black Spot had taken it right down to bare canes. The extension agent, not Pembroke, the one before, told me to burn the whole bed and start over. Your grandmother came over with a bucket of something that smelled like the back end of a barnyard, and I don't know what was in it, and I never asked. Come July, my roses took first at the county show. She wouldn't take a cent." Elowen smiled small. "That sounds like her. There's another thing, something I've held on to because I didn't know who to tell. 20 years ago, maybe 22, a man came to see your grandmother. She was still in her prime, then still had her red in her hair. Your granddaddy had been in the ground about 5 years. Your father was a teenager, and this man came in a fine car and offered her more money for the drowned land than any of the good ground in this county was worth. I know because your grandmother told my mother, and my mother told me on the day she died." Elowen went very still. The copper wire was cool in her fingers. "Who was the man?" Ruth looked at her sideways, a careful measuring look. "I never asked. Your grandmother wouldn't say. She said only that she would sooner sell the roof over her head than that particular field, that particular acre. Said the ground down there was owed something, and she meant to pay it. She refused him 3 times before he stopped coming. Never explained what she meant. Never spoke his name in front of me or anyone I know." A long silence sat between them on the porch step. The cardinal called again. Somewhere down the road, a truck engine started, ran a moment, cut off. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "I don't know what your grandmother left you in that attic, Elowen, but I know she was not a foolish woman, and I know that field means something none of us have ever been told." After Ruth left, Elowen went inside, sat at the kitchen table, took the tin box from the drawer where she had put it. She opened the lid. She lifted out the metal, turned it over in her fingers, read the small stamped words on the back, "For Valor." She lifted out the photograph. 2 young men in doughboy uniforms. Her grandfather Thomas, unmistakable, on the left. The other soldier on the right, his face erased with a diagonal slash of graphite, pressed so hard the paper had almost torn through. She held the photograph up to the kerosene lamp on the table. The light caught the pencil mark at an angle, made the ridges of it stand out like scars. Beneath the mark, she thought if she looked long enough and hard enough, she could see the ghost of a jaw. The suggestion of a mouth. A cleft chin, maybe. She could not make it into a face she knew, but she could make it into a face. A living face once that someone had tried very hard to bury. She put the photograph away. She put the metal away. She sat at the table until the lamp guttered low, listening to the rain. Start up again on the tin roof of the back porch, thinking about a man in a fine car 20 years ago, and a man in a Packard last week, and a grandmother who had turned down enough money to change her life because the ground down there was owed something. She could not put the pieces together. She could feel their weight. She could feel the shape of the thing they made without being able to name it. The rain went on for 11 days. On the 9th day, Ruth's boy Samuel, who worked at the grain elevator with Alden, drove up in his truck with a bag of chicken feed as a favor, told Elowen that the Wabash had crested 6 inches higher than the Great Flood of 1913. On the 10th day, a wire came from her aunt in town, saying the auction house had received 3 inquiries about the property. On the 11th day, the rain slackened to mist, and Elowen walked down to the drowned land, in the last hour before dark, waded out to the nearest stick, put her hand around it, felt for anything. She felt only cold, wet wood and the pull of the current under the surface. No swelling, no warmth, no secret rising. The stick moved a little in her fingers, loose in the mud, as though it were ready to come out at the slightest tug. She stood in the water with the sky turning bruised purple over the tree line, and she thought for the first time plainly and without flinching that this might all be a mistake, that her grandmother might have been what the town said she was, that she herself might be what her father said she was. She stayed there until the light was almost gone. Then she walked back to the house through the mud, took her boots off on the porch, went to bed without eating. The dream came again that night, her grandfather in the doughboy uniform standing in the drowned land. This time the water was to his chest, still rising. I was holding out his hand, and this time she could see what was in it. A folded piece of paper, brown at the edges, sealed with a smear of dark wax. I was trying to give it to her, but every time she reached the water rose another inch and pulled him further away. She woke with tears on her face, the sheets damp with sweat, the pre-dawn quiet of the house pressing on her like a stone. The knock came 4 nights later. It was well past 10 o'clock an hour when no one in Mercer County came to a woman's door without either a death in the family or a bottle. Elowen sat up in bed. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps on the front door, not the kitchen door where a neighbor would knock. She reached for her grandmother's shawl on the bedpost, wrapped it around her nightgown, took the kerosene lamp from the dresser, went slowly down the front stairs. The stairs complained under her weight. The knock did not come a third time. When she reached the door, she stood with her hand on the iron latch for a full minute listening. She heard the wind in the sycamore. She heard the tick of the parlor clock. She heard at the far edge of hearing an engine starting somewhere down the county road, a slow, deliberate engine, a car with weight to it, not a farm truck. She turned the latch. She opened the door. The porch was empty. The blue steps she had painted glowed pale under the moon. Beyond the steps, the lane stretched empty to the road, wet and shining. On the top step, exactly where Ruth had set the basket of eggs, lay a manila envelope. It was the color of old butter, worn soft at the corners, tied shut with a length of black shoelace. Elowen crouched, picked it up. The envelope had weight, but not much. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table under the lamp she had just lit, sat down in her grandmother's chair. She untied the shoelace with hands that shook only a little. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a legal document printed on heavy stock, the ink faded to the color of old blood. At the top, in ornamented capitals, the words promissory note. Below, filled in with a fountain pen in a firm masculine hand, the details. Dated the 14th of September, 1917. The undersigned Thomas Alden Whitaker of Mercer County, State of Indiana, in consideration of the sum of $800 lawful money of the United States, did hereby pledge as security for said loan the parcel of land described as the westernmost 40 acres of the Whitaker homestead, including all improvements and water rights appurtenant thereto. Repayment in full to be tendered upon return of the borrower from military service, or in the event of the borrower's death or incapacity upon demand of the lender. Signed at the bottom in her grandfather's careful schoolboy hand, Thomas A. Whitaker. Signed on the line beside in a hand she did not know but had begun to suspect S. Ashford. She read the paper 3 times. Her ears rang. The kerosene lamp seemed suddenly very bright, then very dim, then very bright again. $800 in 1917. A fortune to a young farmer with a pregnant wife, a father-in-law with a bad back, a country going to war. Her grandfather had ridden the train to Indianapolis to enlist in September of 1917. Family lore said he had left with a full pocket for his wife and mother, though no one had ever asked where the money had come from. He had died in France in October of 1918. He had never come home to pay any debt to any man. The note said upon demand of the lender. There was no stamp, no seal, no cancellation, no signature on the back releasing the pledge. It looked for all the world like a debt that had been sleeping for 35 years and had just now been laid on her kitchen table with the polite quiet of a threat. Elowen sat very still for a long time. The clock in the parlor struck 11. She thought about Silas Ashford's white face at the fence. She thought about the 20-year-old story of a man in a fine car offering more money than the land was worth. She thought about her grandmother saying the ground down there was owed something. She thought about the photograph upstairs in the tin box. 2 young men in doughboy uniforms, one face slashed through with pencil. Her grandfather. And a man whose initial matched the signature on the paper in her hand. She stood up. She walked to the front door in her bare feet. She opened it. The porch was still empty. The moon had moved a hand's breadth across the sky. The lane still stretched down to the road, wet and shining. There was no car, no man, no sound. Whoever had laid this envelope on her step had come and gone in silence. Meant to be gone meant her to find this thing alone in the middle of the night with no one to turn to. She closed the door. She slid the bolt. She carried the envelope back to the kitchen table, sat down again, spread the paper flat under the lamplight. She read her grandfather's signature. She read the name beside it. She read the phrase upon demand of the lender. Then she folded the paper carefully, laid it beside the tin box with the metal and the erased face, and she spoke into the empty kitchen, the first true word she had said in weeks. "You came here in the dark to scare a girl. You should have known better than to try." Her voice was steadier than her hands. Outside, somewhere out over the drowned land, a bittern called once across the water, a low rolling note like a drum in a mud-bottom barrel. Elowen sat at the table until the sky over the sycamore began to turn the color of raw iron, thinking about her grandmother, thinking about the note in the attic, thinking about the note on the table, thinking about how a woman who talked to plants and believed in old country nonsense had held 40 acres of nothing against a man who ate mortgages for breakfast for 20 years on the strength of what? On the strength of what secret? On the strength of what weapon of her own? At first light, she rose dressed, laced her boots, walked down to the drowned land in the mist. The water lay flat as a mirror. The sticks broke the surface gray as gunmetal unchanged. She waded out to the nearest one, put her hand around it, felt for anything, felt only cold, wet wood. She waded to the next. Cold, wet, wood. She waded to the third. Something along the length of the bark, a hint of give, a softness that had not been there. She crouched down until the water lapped at her chin, put her face close to the stick, looked at the place where the bark met the surface of the mud. She could not tell in that gray light whether she was seeing what she wanted to see or what was actually there. A pale swelling maybe, a thread of white finer than a spider's silk maybe reaching down into the dark. She would have to wait for more light. She would have to wait for time. She would have to wait for the man who had come in the dark to come again, this time in daylight. This time to her face, because a woman who has laid a debt on your table means to collect it in person. She stood up in the water. She looked out across the 200 sticks in the flooded field. Out across the 40 acres her grandfather had pledged for $800 in the last September of his life. Out across the ground that her grandmother had said more than once was owed something. The mist began to lift. A single crow called from the sycamore behind the house, harsh and clear, the sound of a country morning starting whether anyone was ready or not. Elowen Whitaker put her hand back on the willow cutting where she thought she had felt a root. She whispered low so that only the water and the wood and the ghost could hear, "You had better start growing. I have a fight ahead of me now and I cannot fight it alone." The bittern called again, further off. The mist lifted another hand's breadth. In the drowned land, 200 dead sticks stood in the water and gave no sign. But the girl who had planted them turned toward the house with her jaw set and her father's stubborn set to her shoulders, and the same pale gray in her eyes that had looked out of a doughboy's face in a photograph 34 years ago. The bank man was coming Tuesday. The rain would come again. The debt on the kitchen table would come walking up her lane in a Packard sooner than late. But so God willing would the roots. So God willing would the roots. The three men came down the lane in Cyrus Hollister's black sedan on the first Saturday in May, the tires kicking up a fine spray from puddles that had not yet dried in a week of stronger sun. Elowen watched them from the porch through the wavy old glass of the parlor window, watched the doors open on both sides, watched Silas Ashford unfold from the passenger seat with the same easy authority that made men at the county fair step aside without knowing why. Edgar Pembroke climbed out of the back clipboard, clutched to his chest like a shield against weather. Cyrus Hollister came around the front of the car, adjusting his hat, his face already composed into the sympathetic mask that bankers wear when they mean to take something from you. They did not knock at the door. They walked straight past the house, straight to the pasture gate, straight down the slope toward the drowned land, as though the property already belonged to them, and Elowen were a tenant to be tolerated for the length of an afternoon. She set down the coffee cup that had gone cold in her hand. She untied her apron. She followed them out into the light without hurrying, because a girl who runs after men like these has already lost the ground before the argument begins. She caught them at the third row of cuttings. Ashford was ahead of the other two, walking with a kind of controlled hunger, his fine boots sinking into the mud he had not chosen to notice. He stopped at a stick bent, picked at the bark with his thumbnail straightened. His face was different now than it had been at the fence in April. Whatever had made him white then had been packed away behind a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Whitaker, I trust the spring has treated you kindly." Elowen came to a stop 6 feet from him, hands loose at her sides, the way her grandmother had stood when a man was talking down to her from a full inch above her hat. "Kind enough, Mr. Ashford. My grandmother used to say that spring in Mercer County is like a stranger who buys you a drink. You'd best count your teeth after." Hollister cleared his throat with the small, dry sound of a man moving business along. "Miss Whitaker, we have come out today, the three of us, in the spirit of neighborliness. The bank has been reviewing your account. There are certain realities that must be discussed before the growing season is upon us in earnest." "Discuss away, Mr. Hollister. The Willows and I have all morning." Pembroke stepped forward with the clipboard already open, his magnifying glass in his other hand. He seemed almost eager in the way of a man about to be proven right in front of witnesses that mattered. He crouched at the nearest stick, scraped a fingernail down the bark, examined the shaving under the glass. "As I predicted, no cambium activity. The tissue is desiccated. This one is essentially dead wood standing in water." He moved to the next stick, repeated the operation. "The same. No sign of viable growth." He moved to a third, bent close, held the glass steady. He did not straighten. Silas Ashford was already turning back toward the men with a smile, prepared some remark about the tragedy of youthful stubbornness on the tip of his tongue. Hollister was reaching for the leather folio under his arm. Neither of them noticed at first that Pembroke had gone still as a heron in shallow water. Elowen noticed. She stepped closer. Pembroke's face, which normally carried a color like weak tea, had gone the color of skimmed cream at the edges. His mouth had opened slightly. His breath came shallow through his nose. She followed the line of his gaze down to the base of the cutting where the bark met the black surface of the mud. The cutting had rooted. Not the ghost of a root, not the wish of a root, not the wet dark smudge she had thought she saw at first light 2 weeks ago. Actual roots. White hair, fine, the color of new milk, spreading outward from the base in a splayed hand, disappearing into the wet clay. On the stem itself, where a node had been dry as a broken match, a swelling of pale green flesh had pushed the bark aside. A bud. She could count 3 of them from where she stood on this one cutting alone. Pembroke whispered a word that was not quite a word. It was more the shape of a word, the mouth of a man who had spent 20 years telling farmers what was and was not possible in soil and weather, in the stubborn, dumb chemistry of dirt and water, and who was now looking at a thing his university bulletins had assured him could not happen. "This is not," he tried again, "the anaerobic conditions, the pH. There should be no primordia. There should be." He turned his head slowly, looked at the next cutting and the next, seeing. Now for the first time what he had missed on his first pass, because he had come with his mind already made up. Some of the sticks had roots, some did not. A fair many did. A handful, 3 or 4 in the row nearest him, showed the pale green of buds already breaking the bark like the first thin crescent of a fingernail moon. Silas Ashford had noticed the silence behind him now. He came back down the row with the easy irritation of a man who cannot understand why the world will not simply hand him what he has come for. "Pembroke, what is your professional opinion?" Pembroke straightened. He did not turn to look at Ashford. He looked at Elowen instead, and something passed across his face that she would remember for a long time. The small, ashamed panic of a professional man watching his authority walk out the door in his own boots. His mouth worked. "The cuttings show signs of..." He cleared his throat. "There is some evidence of..." "Speak up, man." "They're rooting." Pembroke managed so low that Ashford took a step closer to hear him. "In this water, in this clay, against every protocol, they are rooting." Ashford's face did not change. He looked down at the cutting Pembroke had been examining. He looked at the white threads in the mud. He looked at the small green swellings on the bark. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes flickered once, a fast, unpleasant thing like the shutter of a camera closing on a picture he did not want taken. Then he laughed. It was a big man's laugh, aimed at the sky, calibrated for the ears of the banker at his elbow. Well now, ladies and gentlemen, that is what we call a piece of pond scum. Any cutting in standing water will grow a fuzz of algae at the base. Any bud on a willow will swell in warm weather, whether the tree is alive or not. Pembroke, I would appreciate it if you would not alarm this young woman with technical language she has no way to interpret. Pembroke's face flushed. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the cutting again, at the unmistakable difference between algae and root, between water swelling and cambium. And he did not in that moment correct the richest man in Mercer County in front of the girl whose land they had come to take. He looked down at his clipboard instead as though the answer might be printed on the top page. Elowen said quiet, "Mr. Pembroke, when you were kneeling just now, you saw what you saw. I saw your face. My grandmother used to say that a man who has to unsay a true thing in front of witnesses is a man who has already lost the day, even if he does not know it yet." Ashford's laugh cut off short. Hollister, who had been watching the whole exchange with the careful stillness of an animal in a leg trap, deciding whether to chew, closed his leather folio without opening it. "Miss Whitaker, perhaps this is not the morning for the discussion we came to have. We will revisit the property in June when the growing season is more advanced." "I'll be here, Mr. Hollister. So will the Willows." The three of them walked back to the car in a broken line, Ashford in front, with his shoulders squared, Pembroke behind with his shoulders bowed. Hollister was the last to reach the sedan. He paused at the driver's door, looked back at Elowen across the pasture, tipped his hat once. Not friendly, not quite. Careful. The tip of a man who has just seen something he will need to think about after his supper. The sedan turned in the yard, went back up the lane, took a long time to disappear over the low-rise where the county road began. Elowen stood in the field with her hand on the cutting the extension agent had unsaid. She could feel the small, hard swelling of the bud under her thumb. She could feel the roots in the mud, though she could not see them. She stood there until her boots began to leak. May and June ran together into one long green rising. The cuttings did what the cuttings had been told to do by the note in her grandmother's spidery hand. The sticks became saplings. The saplings became slender trees. By the first week of June, they were shoulder-high on Elowen, with trunks no thicker than her wrist, and leaves the pale silver green of the underside of an aspen, catching the morning light like coins in a stream bed. By the last week of June, they had reached the top of her head, and the roots that Pembroke had refused to name in front of Silas Ashford had thickened from spider silk to bootlace, from bootlace to pencil, spreading outward through the wet clay in a widening web that Elowen could not see, but could feel in the way the field held her weight now firmer, no longer sucking at her heels. Word ran along the county road on the wind of small trucks. Ruth Calloway brought a group of Methodist women out to the fence on the second Sunday of June, 4 of them in Sunday hats, standing in a row like a jury, while Elowen moved among the young trees with a watering can. She did not really need to carry, because the field carried its own water now in the deep of it, but she carried the can because a girl in a field of miracles is at least an ordinary girl when she is watering. 2 of the women crossed themselves. One of them, the oldest, whose husband had farmed corn on the ridge above the drowned land for 40 years, put her hand on the top rail of the fence and would not speak. Ruth caught Elowen's eye across the pasture, gave the smallest lift of her chin. That was the day Elowen understood that the county was no longer simply amused by her. She did not in those weeks forget the manila envelope. She did not forget the promissory note folded in her grandmother's Bible on the kitchen shelf, or the medal in the erased face in the tin box beside it. She did not forget Silas Ashford's laugh at the third row of cuttings, the laugh of a man who had told a lie in daylight and expected it to stand. On the second Friday of June, she took the morning off from the field, put on a clean dress her aunt had left in the front closet, walked the 1.75 miles into town to the Mercer County Courthouse on Court Street. She had never been inside the county recorder's office in her life. She stood at the counter with her hands folded until a woman with a bun the color of iron pointed her toward the deed books along the back wall, and she spent 4 hours there in the dust-smelling quiet, turning oversized pages under a green glass lamp, following the paper trail of the Whitaker 40 acres from her grandfather's father, back through 3 generations of Whitakers forward, through the death of her grandfather in October of 1918, forward through the widow's claim filed by her grandmother in the spring of 1919. There was no lien filed against the 40 acres. No mortgage, no encumbrance, no note recorded in the courthouse from any lender named Ashford or from any lender at all. The property had passed cleanly to Cordelia Whitaker on the death of her husband, but that was the courthouse record. That was the public paper. The document in the manila envelope had been a private promissory note between 2 men going off to war, of the kind that the law would honor if produced with an original signature and no proof of payment, and would not honor if it could not be produced at all. Elowen understood standing at the deed books in her clean dress that the paper laid on her step in the dark had been laid there precisely because it could be produced. It was the only copy anyone knew of. Its existence was its weapon. She turned to leave. On her way out, she stopped at the front counter and asked casually as she could whether the office kept any records of business transactions of Silas Ashford. The woman with the iron bun narrowed her eyes. Business transactions are private, dear. We keep deeds and marriages and death certificates. Not a man's ledger. Elowen thanked her, walked toward the door, then paused as though remembering. One more thing. Would you have any old military records, a photograph or a unit roster from the Great War? The woman's expression softened. Only what the Veterans Hall keeps. That's 2 blocks down above the barbershop. Charlie Merck is the caretaker. He was in it himself. He'll show you what he has if you ask nice. Elowen walked the 2 blocks. She climbed the narrow stairs above the barbershop. Charlie Merck was 70 if he was a day, wore a green eye shade indoors, kept a cat named Sergeant on the desk. She told him she was Thomas Whittaker's granddaughter, and his face went soft the way old men's faces do when they meet the living blood of a dead friend. He brought out a photograph album so heavy she had to help him lift it to the table. He turned the pages slowly, telling her the names, until he came to a page where 2 men in doughboy uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder against a wall of stacked crates, their caps tilted at identical angles. It was the same photograph she had upstairs at home. Only in Charlie Merck's album, the face on the right had not been erased. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The face on the right belonged to Silas Ashford at 24. That's your granddad on the left, Charlie said, tapping the picture with a knuckle knotted by arthritis. Best man I ever knew. And that's Silas Ashford, beside him the same Silas that owns half the county now. They went over together in the summer of 18. Same company, same platoon. Argonne Forest. October, right at the end of it. Thomas was killed making the last push, they told us. Silas came home in December with a shoulder full of shrapnel and a cane he still uses in bad weather. I wouldn't talk about it. None of us who came back could. Charlie's hand rested on the photograph a moment longer. Your granddad saved that man's life at Argonne. That's the story I heard from a fellow named Buck Halloran who was in the same trench. Silas Ashford would have died in a shell hole if Thomas Whittaker had not pulled him out. That's the story. Silas has never confirmed it. Silas has never denied it. Silas has never spoken of Thomas Whittaker in my hearing for 34 years. Elowen felt the small, dry click of a piece falling into place in the back of her mind, the sound of a lock being made ready to turn. She thanked Charlie Merck. She walked home in the long, slow light of a June evening, the cottonwoods along Miller's Creek, shaking their leaves like tambourines above her head, the drowned land already visible from the top of the last rise, a low, dark green rectangle against the pale gold of the surrounding pastures. Her grandmother had known. Her grandmother had lived 20 years across the fence from the man her husband had saved 20 years, while that man had prospered on land that had one way or another been paid for by a debt that could never be collected, and her grandmother had said nothing and refused every offer and grown roses and waited. For what? For this. For a granddaughter with mud on her hands and dead sticks in the water and a note in the attic that said trust. July came in hot. The willows were 9 feet tall now, some of them 10, their crowns beginning to interlock in the closer rows, so that a person walking between them would find themselves in a green tunnel that smelled of wet bark and the peppery bruised smell of leaves. The mud at their base was no longer mud. It was earth. Not garden earth, not yet, but soil that would crumble in your hand, soil that had color, soil that took a print of your boot and let you lift the boot back out without a wet slap. Elowen dug down one morning with a trowel between 2 saplings and turned up an earthworm the length of her finger, pink and healthy, coiling in her palm. She had never seen an earthworm in that field in her life. Her grandfather had said the drowned land was too sour and too cold for worms. On the second Tuesday of July, Silas Ashford's Packard rolled down the lane again. This time it came alone. Ashford climbed out in a lighter suit, his tie loosened, his straw hat pushed back on his silver head. He did not go to the fence. He came to the porch. He stood at the bottom of the blue steps and called up in a voice pitched for a friendly visit, the voice of an uncle who has come to talk sense into a niece. Miss Whittaker, would you spare an old man a glass of cold water in 10 minutes of your afternoon? Elowen was standing at the screen door with a dish towel in her hands. She had heard the car from a quarter-mile off. She had known who it was before he cut the engine. She pushed the screen door open, stepped out, did not offer him a chair. I don't keep ice, Mr. Ashford. My cistern water is what I have, if that will do. That will do fine. She brought the water in a jelly jar. He took it in his gloved hand, drank half of it, without sitting wiped his mouth with the back of the glove. His eyes were on the field behind the house on the line of green where there had been no green in April. Well, you have made your point, young lady. I will not stand here and pretend otherwise. Your grandmother, God rest her, was a woman of unusual instincts. She was a woman of a great many kinds of memory, Mr. Ashford. That is not the same thing as instinct. He glanced at her sharply. The friendly uncle slipped for one clear second, and something older, harder, more hungry looked out. Then the uncle came back. I came here today because I have been made aware of certain financial pressures on your family. It has come to my attention that your father Alden owes a considerable sum to the county cooperative for seed and equipment advanced on credit 3 years ago, back when he took the notion he might try farming again on the ridge. The co-op is not a patient creditor. They have been carrying that debt at interest for a long time. My father's affairs are his own. Ordinarily, I would agree with you, but those affairs became my affairs last week. I have purchased that note from the co-op in full. Your father, Alden Whitaker, now owes $1,147 plus accumulated interest to me personally. He watched her face for the flinch he expected. I mention this not as a threat. I mention it as a fact you should have. I have no intention of pressing your father for payment. I am aware that he holds a position at the grain elevator, a position which, as you may know, exists at the pleasure of the board of directors, of which I am a founding member. I am not in the business of ruining working men. I mention these facts only so that you can understand the full picture when you consider my offer for the property. A fair offer. A generous offer considering the encumbrances involved. An offer that would clear your father's debt, satisfy the bank, put a graduate teacher's salary in your pocket for the next 4 years. Elowen took the jelly jar from him. Her hand was steady. She could hear her own pulse in her ears like a drum in another room, but her hand was steady. Mr. Ashford, when you were at the fence in April, before you had seen the roots, before you had heard the extension, Agent Unsay the truth. You looked at me across that field like a man who had seen a ghost. Would you tell me now, standing here on my porch, whose ghost that was? Silas Ashford's face did not go white this time. It went, if anything, more still. The way a pond goes still just before a heron strikes. I am sure I do not know what you mean. I think you do. I think this heat is telling on you, Miss Whitaker. My offer will stand for 1 week. After that, the pressures I have mentioned will begin to move without my direct assistance. I do not control them. Bankers act, boards vote, debts come due. I would strongly counsel you to consider what a young woman with no husband and no crop can hold against the ordinary current of business in this county. He tipped his hat. He walked back to the Packard. He drove away with his window down, an elbow on the sill, as easy as any man who has ever told a lie in a fine suit. Elowen stood on the porch until the dust had settled in the lane. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, opened her grandmother's ledger book that had come down from the attic in the same load as the sticks. She turned the pages until she found the accounts for the last decade of her grandfather's father's life. She turned them for a long time. She did not find in her grandmother's meticulous script a single record of a payment made or received from anyone named Ashford. Whatever her grandmother had held against Silas for 35 years, it had not been recorded in the household books. It had been held somewhere else. In her head. In a hiding place. In a box that had not yet been opened. That evening, Elowen walked into town to the grain elevator. The sun was low behind her. The tin roof of the elevator threw a long shadow across the tracks. Her father Alden was in the yard, hosing off the loader in his coveralls, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked up when he heard her step on the gravel. He set the hose down. He did not smile. It had been 3 weeks since she had seen him last, and each time she saw him, he looked thinner than she remembered. "Pa, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to give me a straight answer." Alden reached for the rag in his back pocket, wiped his hand slow. "All right, girl, ask. Do you owe money to Silas Ashford?" Alden's whole body went still the way a man's body goes still when a doctor has just spoken. His hand stopped in the rag. His eyes went past her, out over the tracks, out toward the elevator. His mouth worked once. "How do you know that?" "Then it's true. It was to the co-op. It was to the co-op for 3 years. I have been paying it down when I could. It is not to the co-op anymore, Pa. Silas Ashford bought the note. He came to the porch today to tell me so. He told me that if I do not sell him the drowned land, he will pull the note, and he will pull your job, and he will pull them both in the same week." Alden Whitaker was a man who had spent 42 years teaching himself not to weep. He did not weep now. He put the rag back in his pocket with the precise, slow care of a man who has just been told his house is on fire and cannot yet remember where his children sleep. He looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke in a voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear him over the compressor humming behind the office. Elowen, you have to sell that farm. Pa, you have to sell that farm and you have to sell it to Silas Ashford. There is no other buyer with that kind of cash on hand in the whole county. If you do not sell to him, he will take everything anyway and slower, and there will be nothing left for either of us. I have been 30 years at that elevator. I do not have another trade. I am 42 years old, and I have arthritis in my right hand that will not let me lift a bale of hay by sundown. If I lose the job, I lose the roof over my own head in town, and I lose it before Christmas. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand exactly what you are telling me. I understand that you are asking me to hand a lifetime of your mother's stubbornness to the man she refused for 20 years because you are afraid of losing a paycheck. The words came out harder than she had meant them, and she watched them land in her father's face like small stones. Alden flinched. Then for the first time in her memory, his own hardness matched hers. He stepped toward her closer than a father steps to a daughter in a public yard, and his voice was tight as a wire pulled to snapping. You do not know what you are talking about, girl. You do not know what my mother did or did not do. You do not know what she paid to keep that field, or who she paid it to, or what she owed the man she married. You have got a note in the attic and a wild story from Ruth Calloway, and you think you understand this family. You understand nothing. Nothing. Sell the farm. No. Elowen. I said no, Pa. He turned. He picked up the hose. He turned the water back on. He walked away from her to the far side of the loader, and he did not turn around when she left the yard. She walked home in the long summer twilight past the Methodist church and the Veterans Hall and the barber shop below Charlie Merck's stairs. And she cried the whole way, not the sobbing kind of crying, but the steady dropping kind, the kind that leaves streaks in the dust on a girl's cheek and does not care who sees. When she got home, she did not eat. She did not light the lamp. She sat on the blue porch steps until the whip-poor wills began to call in the sycamore, and then she went inside, went to her grandmother's Bible on the kitchen shelf, opened it to the promissory note tucked between the leaves of Ruth, read her grandfather's schoolboy signature until she could see it with her eyes closed. There was a fight ahead of her. She was, as she had told the Willows a lifetime ago in April, going to have to fight it alone. The storm came in on the last night of July. It had been building for 2 days, the air so heavy that the flies would not fly, the barn cats gone under the porch by 4 in the afternoon. The first thunder rolled in around supper time, a low, continuous grumble far off to the southwest over the Illinois line. By 9 o'clock, the wind had come up. By 10, the rain was coming sideways, sheeting across the porch, driving under the eaves in silver bars, visible in the light of the kitchen window. Elowen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea gone cold, listening to the sycamore work against the corner of the house, listening to the tin roof over the back porch drum like a snare, listening for something else beneath the storm. Some sound she could not have named until she heard it. She heard it a few minutes past 11. A dull, rhythmic thud muffled by rain coming from the direction of the field. Not thunder. Thunder rolls. This was a struck sound, a bitten sound, the sound of a heavy blade meeting wet wood. Once, a pause. Twice, a pause. 3 times quicker, the sound of a man finding his rhythm. She was on her feet before the third stroke had finished. She grabbed her grandmother's oilcloth slicker off the peg by the door. She took the lantern from the shelf, fumbled a match twice before it caught, held the light up. She pushed through the screen door out into a wall of water so dense the porch rail vanished at arm's length. She ran. Her boots skidded in the mud of the path down to the field. The wind snatched at the slicker, tried to fold her double. The lantern threw a wet yellow circle that jumped and skidded in the rain. Ahead of her, over the rise, she saw a flash of movement. A dark shape hunched at the base of a willow. The lift and fall of a heavier, darker shape above it. The dull thud again. She screamed. The scream came out of her without a plan, without a word, the raw, split-open sound a woman makes when the last small thing she has been carrying is taken. You stop. You stop right there. You stop. The shape at the base of the tree straightened up. It was too far off in the rain to see the face. It saw her lantern. It threw one last stroke down at the trunk, threw the axe aside into the mud with a splash ran. She saw the shape of a man in a slicker and hat running low across the drowned land toward the fence line, and she saw the deeper, darker shape of another figure at the far fence. A car with its engine running and its lights off, and then the shape of the man reached the fence, went over it, disappeared into the passenger side of the car, and the car pulled away without lights along the tractor path that led out to the county road. Elowen stood in the rain with the lantern held above her head, and she looked at what had been done. She would count the trees later in the gray daylight. She would find that 42 of them had been struck cleanly at the base, the trunks lying now half in the water and half on the mud, their crowns already beginning to wilt in the rain because a cut willow at that stage of growth cannot draw water. She would find the axe in the mud at the base of the last tree the man had struck before her lantern caught him. She would kneel beside the axe in the rain, and she would turn it over in her hands, and she would find carved into the wooden handle just below the head 2 neat initials burned into the grain with a hot iron S. She did not carry the axe back to the house that night. She left it where it lay. She sat down in the mud beside the nearest fallen willow in the rain and the dark, and she put her hand on the wet stump where the tree had been cut, and she did not cry. She had used up the crying 2 days before at her father's yard. What came out of her instead was a long, low sound she did not recognize as her own voice, a sound halfway between a moan and a curse. The sound of a girl who has just understood that the man she has been fighting is not fighting. Fair has never fought fair, will never fight fair, because fair is not the country he lives in. The rain slackened toward dawn. She walked back to the house through the mud with the axe in her hand. She set the axe on the kitchen table beside the promissory note in her grandmother's Bible, beside the tin box with the medal and the erased face. She sat at the table with all 3 objects in front of her. And when the first gray light came into the window over the sink, she stood up, walked to the barn, hitched the old mule cart she had never used to the neighbor's pony. Ruth had loaned her for chores, drove into town to the sheriff's office on Court Street. Sheriff Bud Corliss was a heavy man in his 50s who had been sheriff since before Elowen was born. He listened to her tell it. He looked at the axe on his desk. He turned it over in his big hands, ran his thumb over the burned initials. Sighed the way a man sighs when he is about to say a thing he does not want to say. Elowen, I have known you since you were on your grandmother's hip. I want you to know I take this seriously. But an axe with initials on it is not the same as a man swinging it. Silas Ashford was in Fort Wayne last night at a bankers' convention. There are 20 men who will swear he was in the ballroom of the Anthony Hotel from 6 in the evening until well past midnight. His car was seen there. His signature is in the register. I can send a deputy down to the Willow field this morning to look at the tracks, but the rain has washed everything, and even if we found tracks, an axe with initials is not a man. The axe belongs to him. The axe may belong to him. He may have lent it to a hired hand. He may have had it stolen off a woodpile a year ago. He may say any of those things. I cannot arrest a man on an axe. She looked at Bud Corliss across his desk, and she understood the shape of a certain kind of power for the first time in her life. It was not the power to break the law. It was the power to make sure that when the law came, it did not quite reach you. She thanked him for his time. She left the axe on his desk as evidence he had not asked for. She drove the pony cart back home through a town that was already talking about the storm. By afternoon, everyone knew. Ruth came up the lane in her Sunday shoes, hugged Elowen on the porch. Without speaking, walked with her down to the field, stood beside her while she counted the fallen. 42 trees, a fifth of what she had planted. The wilt was already in the leaves. The stumps stood raw and white, the fresh wood shining in the cloud-gray light. Silas Ashford himself paid a visit that evening. He came in the Packard. He came with a face of sorrowful sympathy pinned on like a Sunday brooch. He stood at the fence hat in his hand, and he called across the pasture in a voice loud enough for Ruth in her yard down the road to hear it. Miss Whitaker, I heard the terrible news. Vandalism of this kind is a scourge on our county. I wish to renew my offer for the property. In light of the damage sustained, I have adjusted the figure downward to reflect the diminished value of the plantings, but I want you to know my offer remains open out of my respect for your grandmother and out of concern for your future. Elowen did not walk down to the fence. She did not answer. She stood on the porch with her hand on the top rail of the blue steps, and she watched him tip his hat, watched him climb back into his Packard, watched him drive away. Ruth, who had come back for a second visit with a covered dish of stew, stood beside her and made a sound in her throat that was not quite a word. That man. That man, Elowen agreed. That man had those trees cut, Elowen. I do not care what a sheriff in Fort Wayne says. I know he did. I know you know. Ruth, I need you to know something. I am not going to sell. I am not going to sell if the bank comes tomorrow with the paperwork. I am not going to sell if my father asks me on his knees. I am not going to sell if the Willows all die by morning. Do you understand? I understand, child. God help me, I understand. The next 10 days were the longest of her life. She did not go down to the field for the first 3 of them, could not bear to see the wilt taking the fallen crowns from silver green to yellow to the brittle brown of old paper. She patched the roof over the parlor where the storm had lifted a shingle. She wrote a letter to her aunt in town. She read her grandmother's Bible clear through the book of Ruth twice. She did not sleep well. On the 4th morning, she made herself walk down to the field at first light, because she believed that a girl who cannot face what she has lost has already lost more than the thing itself. She walked between the standing willows, 42 of them, missing now gaps in the green like teeth pulled from a jaw. She reached the row where the axe had done its heaviest work. She stopped. She had expected to see the stumps as she had left them. Raw, white. The last living rings of the wood showing at the top, like the annual pages of a book someone had slammed shut. What she saw instead made her breath catch and hold in her throat until her ribs hurt. From the top of each stump, from the cambium ring, just under the bark, from the wet inner life of the willow that had refused to accept the axe as the final word, small green shoots had begun to push up. Not 1 shoot per stump, not 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 shoots on some of them ringed around the top of the cut like the fingers of a hand opening from the wrist. She counted 7 on one, 8 on the next. The shoots were 1 inch, maybe 2 inches long, pale green, new, impossibly defiantly mathematically new. She knelt down in the mud in her nightgown because she had come out without changing, and she put both hands on the stump nearest her, and she felt the shoots against her palms. She understood then with the whole quick jolt of a lock finally turning what her grandmother had known that Silas Ashford had not. Willows do not die of being cut. Willows multiply from being cut. The axe that had come in the night to kill her 42 trees had in one night's work given her 250 new shoots, maybe 300 ringed around 42 stumps. In a defense, the tree had been born knowing how to mount. Her grandmother had chosen this tree. Her grandmother had chosen this land. Her grandmother had chosen this granddaughter. Her grandmother had known that a fight would come and had planted in the mud an army that could not be killed by any single blow. Elowen sat back on her heels in the mud. She looked up at the sky, which had begun to turn the color of a pearl in the strengthening light. She said out loud to no one and to everyone, "You buried a soldier under me, grandmother. You buried a whole company." She began to laugh. It was not the laugh she had heard at the fence line in April. It was not the laugh of any man she had ever heard. It was the laugh of a girl who has just understood that she is not and has never been alone. August broke open on Mercer County like an oven door had been left standing wide. The rain that had drowned April, that had soaked the fields into June, that had blown the trees down on the last night of July, simply stopped. The sky went a hard, cloudless blue on the 4th of August and stayed that way for the next 21 days without so much as a fair weather cumulus to break the glare. The corn, which had stood shoulder high on the ridges above the drowned land, by the last week of July began to curl its leaves inward, the way a burned page curls at the edges. By the 2nd week of the drought, the pale green tassels had gone the color of old straw. By the 3rd week, whole rows of ears had dropped without filling small hard kernels, rattling in husks that would not fatten. The soybeans on the Kowalski place south of town went yellow at the seams, first, then went yellow all through, then went the flat matte brown of a paper bag left out in the sun. Joe Kowalski walked his own 80 acres one Saturday morning at first light, and when he reached the far fence, sat down in the dust with his hat between his knees and did not get back up for 2 hours. The pastures browned to a brittle crust that broke under a cow's hoof and did not spring back. The stock ponds shrank a foot, then 2, then 3. By the middle of August, farmers were hauling water in metal drums from wells that had already begun to smell of iron in lower depths. Miller's Creek, which had swallowed the bottom field in April, was a dry white ribbon of cracked mud by the 22nd of August. Dead crayfish curled in the cracks like small commas. A few hollow-eyed heifers wandered the near pasture, pulling at grass that had turned to something between straw and stone. The Wabash itself shrank back from its banks a full 10 yards, exposing gravel bars where the older men remembered wading as boys and had not seen dry in 40 years. Edgar Pembroke drove himself half sick that month, hauling from farm to farm with new soil samples and grim mimeographed leaflets about drought-tolerant cover crops, coming home each evening to a wife who had learned not to ask how the day had gone. His clipboard, once a badge, had become a kind of tally sheet of ruin. And Elowen Whitaker's willows grew. They grew the way a green thing grows when it has been told by the roots below it that there is nothing to fear from a dry sky. They put on another foot of height in the first 2 weeks of August alone. Their trunks thickened from the diameter of a broom handle to the diameter of a rolling pin. The crowns closed over the rows so that a person walking between them at noon found herself in a green shade that was cooler by 10 degrees than the pasture 6 feet the other side of the fence. The stumps of the 42 trees Silas Ashford's man had felled in the July storm had by mid-August thrown up such a dense cluster of new shoots that each stump wore a green fountain 3 feet tall, more like a hedge than a tree, and the total count of stems in the field had gone from 200 to nearly 450. Elowen counted them one Sunday afternoon with a piece of chalk marking each trunk with a small tick, and when she was done, she sat down on a stump and laughed until her sides hurt, because her enemy had done the arithmetic of her army for her at his own expense. She had noticed the second miracle a week into the dry spell. She had gone down at dawn with a shovel expecting the worst, and had dug a test hole between 2 of the tallest willows to see how far she would have to go for moisture. She had gone 6 inches. She had found dark earth. She had gone 12 inches. She had found wet clay she could squeeze in her fist and see a bead of water bloom out between her knuckles. Around the base of each tree, in a widening ring that overlapped with its neighbors, a ground cover had begun to establish itself where none of it had lived in her lifetime. Clover plantain, a low creeping grass her grandmother would have called poverty grass, but which held its color where the ridge grasses died, wild violet purslane. Even a scatter of self-seeded pennyroyal that filled the air with a faint mint smell when she walked through it. Where the drought had scoured the county down to bone, the drowned land had become a green room 40 acres wide, laid across the middle of the property like a rug the earth had woven for her. She began to understand then what her grandmother had always known and what no bulletin from any land-grant college would have printed. The willow was not a tree that competed with the land. The willow was a tree that repaired the land. Its roots, thousands of white threads per cubic foot of soil, broke the tight bonds of the clay and let air in where air had not been for a century. Its fallen leaves rotted quickly into a light black humus that fed everything that touched it. Its shade held moisture that the naked ridge could not. Its exhaled water, drawn from a depth other trees could not reach, softened the very sky above it, making the air under its canopy heavier, cooler, more forgiving of the smaller lives that had begun to move in the ground cover. Butterflies came. A bluebird pair took a hole in one of the older stumps. A pair of green herons who had left the county 3 summers back appeared one morning at the low place where the creek used to run. Ruth Calloway walked up the lane on the first Tuesday of September in her wide sun hat, her face lined with the specific worry of a widow who has been counting egg money against feed costs, and she stopped at the porch step and did something Elowen had never seen her do. She twisted her handkerchief. Ruth was not a woman who twisted handkerchiefs. She held her hands still even at funerals. Elowen, I need to ask you a thing, and I would ask it easier if I had not made fun of you myself back in April even a little. My creek bed is dry. Every stock pond on my place is a hole in the ground. If the rains come in October the way they did 4 years ago, I am going to lose the whole east bank into the wash. If they do not come, my pasture will not carry a single head through the winter. Do you have any of those sticks left? Any cuttings? Anything I could put along the creek bed to hold what soil I still have? She said the last part fast, the way a woman says a thing she is embarrassed to need. Elowen took Ruth's hand. She held it for a moment. I don't have cuttings ready, Ruth, but I can make them. Grandmother wrote the instructions on the back of the note. Come back this evening at chore time. I'll have 50 ready for you. She had never made a willow cutting before that morning. She stood at the top of the drowned land with her grandmother's pruning shears in her hand, the same shears with the wooden handle worn smooth by 20 years of a woman's grip, And she moved through the trees, the way her grandmother had moved through her rose bed, selecting the straight new growth of the season, the wood that had reached for the sun through July and hardened into a supple green that would bend but not snap. She cut 50 pieces each a foot long, each clean above a node. She tied them in bundles of 10 with baling twine from the barn. She soaked them for 3 days in the same galvanized tub that had begun the whole enterprise back in March. On the third evening, when Ruth came up the lane, Elowen walked with her back down the road to the Callaway place and showed her how to push the cuttings into the wet edge of the near stock pond 12 inches deep, 6 feet apart. Water will find them. Trust the water. That is not my line. That is the only line my grandmother left me. The next day the Hendersons came. Not Cyrus Hollister the banker, but a cousin family who ran a dairy on the Ridge Road, a husband and wife with cracked hands and a baby on the wife's hip. They stood at the fence in the hot morning and asked in the careful voices of people who have not asked for anything in their lives whether Elowen might have any of those sticks to spare. Then a man named Larson, whose corn had gone to fodder before Labor Day, brought his oldest son in a truck with 3 empty grain sacks in the bed and a sheaf of paper money in his shirt pocket. Elowen took the sacks. She refused the money. She sent them home with 30 cuttings apiece and the same 6-word instructions she had learned to say, without smiling now because she had begun to understand that these were not words a farmer laughed at anymore. Trust the water. Then came Joe Kowalski, who had never spoken a word to Elowen in his life, who had voted at every co-op meeting for policies that had put her father's debt where it was, and who took his hat off at her fence like a man at a graveside. He asked her, with his eyes on the ground, if she could show him what her grandmother's note said about creekside plantings. Elowen brought a chair out into the yard. She sat him down. She copied the note in her own hand onto a scrap of the same brown butcher paper her grandmother had used, and she gave it to him along with 40 cuttings tied in 2 neat bundles. He tried to shake her hand at the end, and when she took it, he held on a second too long, and his eyes filled and he turned away without a word and got back in his truck. By the second week of September, there was a line at the fence some mornings. 6 trucks one Wednesday. A wagon pulled by a mule that must have been 30 years old on Thursday. She could not keep up with the demand from cuttings alone. She began to teach the men themselves to make the cuts so that they could go back to their own land and multiply what she had given them by hand. She stood among the willows in her father's old work shirt, with her hair pulled back in a piece of baling twine, showing men twice her age where to place the shears, how to angle the cut, how to read the bark for last year's growth versus this year's, how to bundle for the 3-day soak. They watched her hands. They did not laugh. They did not ever again, in her hearing, laugh. Silas Ashford in the same weeks was falling. His 500 acres of corn on the ridge above the drowned land had failed as completely as any farm in the county. The state had denied his application for emergency drought assistance on a technicality because he had already 3 years running exceeded his crop insurance ceiling. Cyrus Hollister, who had stood at the fence with him in May and had not liked what he had seen in Elowen's face, had begun to move quietly on notes that Ashford had carried at First Mercantile for a long time. Word came in on the wind the way it always did. Someone had seen the county assessor's car in Ashford's lane twice in 1 week. Someone had heard at the barber shop below Charlie Merck's stairs that 2 of Ashford's hired men had not been paid in 3 weeks, and were talking about it in places where such talk becomes evidence. Alden Whitaker began to come out to the farm again on the weekends. He came without announcing himself. He would arrive early on Saturday morning with a bag of nails or a length of stovepipe he had picked up cheap at the salvage yard, and he would set to work on some small ruin of the property without asking Elowen's permission. He patched the sagging corner of the corn crib. He rehung the barn door on hinges he had brazed himself. The first Saturday he came, he did not speak to her at all, only nodded from the yard when she brought him a jar of cold well water at noon. The second Saturday he sat down on the blue porch step at the end of the day and looked out at the willows and said quiet, without turning to her, "I owe you an apology, girl. It can wait. Take your time, Pa. I intend to." The third Saturday he brought a document. He handed it to her at the kitchen table without speaking. It was a bill of sale from the co-op dated 3 days back for the transfer of a certain debt of $1,147 from Silas Ashford back to the co-op board marked paid in full in a green stamp. She looked up at him. His eyes were red at the rims. He shook his head once sharp. "Not now. You'll get the story when there's a story worth telling. All I will say is that I did not want it hanging over you when the day came. Whichever day." Whatever it looks like. She took his hand across the kitchen table. He let her. He did not in that moment weep, but the way his thumb moved once across the back of her hand was to a girl who had known this man all her life, the same as weeping. Edgar Pembroke came out on the 12th of September at dawn alone. He came in a black Sunday suit that he had clearly aired for the occasion. He held his hat in his hand. He did not bring the clipboard. He waited at the edge of the drowned land for her to come down from the porch, and when she reached him, he did not offer his hand until she offered hers. His palm was cool and dry. He would not meet her eyes at first. When he did, she saw that the certainty had gone out of them, the way water goes out of a broken jar, and something else had been poured in its place. Something more useful than certainty, though it cost him more to carry. Miss Whitaker, I owe you an apology. Several apologies if you have time to hear them. I told you in April that these cuttings would rot. I told you that the soil was wrong. I told you that the conditions were impossible. On the day I came out here with Mr. Hollister and Mr. Ashford in May, I saw with my own eyes that the cuttings had rooted, and I did not name what I saw for what it was, because I was afraid of contradicting Silas Ashford in front of a banker. That was a cowardice. It was mine. It was not the university's. I want you to hear me say that. I hear you. I have been testing your soil these last 3 weeks. I have been taking samples from a depth of 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches, in a grid pattern across the whole 40 acres. The pH under your trees has shifted by very nearly a full point in one growing season. The organic matter content has more than tripled from the reading I took in April. The percolation rate is 9 times faster than the readings I am getting on the ridge above. 9 times. I do not have a word for what these trees are doing to this land, Miss Whitaker, that would satisfy the man who signs my paycheck. I would like, with your permission, to spend the rest of my career trying to earn one. Elowen let him finish. She let the silence sit a moment after he was done, so that he could hear his own words in the still air and know he had meant them. Then she nodded small. Grandmother didn't know it the way you mean, Mr. Pembroke. She never opened a bulletin in her life. She knew because she watched. She watched what grew and what did not for 60 years on this piece of ground. She noticed that the willows along the creek always grew fastest where the floods were worst. She saw that the soil under old willows was darker, richer. She paid attention to what this ground was trying to tell her, instead of telling this ground what it ought to do. There is not a book about it. There is only a woman about it, and now the woman is gone, and what she left is standing behind me. Pembroke nodded. He put his hat back on his head. He looked out across the field one long time. The county is going to ask you to teach us, Miss Whitaker. I am not the last man who will stand here with his hat off. I know it. Let them come. They are coming. The trucks began to arrive in the lane an hour later. She had not expected them all at once. She had expected them the way they had come the week before in 1s and 2s, at the natural pace of a county that had begun to notice her. What arrived on the 12th of September was different. It was a line. It ran down her lane from the porch to the county road and out onto the county road for a quarter mile in the direction of town. Old Fords, older Chevys, a battered green International 2 wagons pulled by draft horses, a Model A with the paint faded to the color of a sun-bleached riverstone, a delivery van from the feed store on Court Street with the driver at the wheel and 3 other men crowded on the bench beside him. Word had gone out at the Grange Hall the night before that Edgar Pembroke himself was going out to the Whitaker place at first light, and that had been enough. The whole county had in one night decided to see for itself. Elowen stood on the blue porch steps with her hand on the rail. Alden was in the yard in his good shirt, having driven out that morning without her knowing why. Ruth Calloway was in the yard beside him. Ruth had made coffee in Elowen's kitchen at 4 in the morning, and now she was pouring it into a series of tin cups on the porch rail, because a woman who understands men understands that a hot cup in the hand of a farmer at a stranger's gate is the difference between a request and a demand. The Packard came last. It rolled down the lane past the parked trucks. The other drivers pulled to the side to let it pass without a word being spoken, the way men give way at a funeral to a family car whose right of place they do not wish to acknowledge but cannot deny. It stopped in the yard between the porch and the pasture gate. Silas Ashford climbed out. He was thinner than he had been in July. His silver hair had gone unruly at the temples. The suit he wore had not been pressed. He walked to the bottom of the blue steps, and he did not tip his hat because he had not brought a hat. He carried instead a long yellow envelope, the kind a lawyer sends. He looked up at her on the porch. He did not smile. Miss Whitaker, I have come to collect on a debt of long standing. I do not enjoy this. I regret the necessity. I have with me here the original promissory note signed by your grandfather in September of 1917 in the amount of $800 secured by the westernmost 40 acres of the Whitaker homestead, together with a statement of interest accrued at the annual rate of 5% compounded from the date of the loan through today's date for a total sum due of $4,512. If you cannot produce that sum by the close of business tomorrow, the 40 acres pass to me under the terms of the security clause. I have counsel present to witness the tender of the note and your response. He held the envelope out. I did it in front of 30 men and 2 women and 1 dairy baby on its mother's hip. He did it with the whole county watching because he had chosen this morning as his last calculated stroke. Having heard, as everyone had heard, that Pembroke was coming, having decided that the humiliation of a girl in front of her neighbors was worth more to him than a private collection would have been, he meant it as an execution. Elowen came down the blue steps. She did not take the envelope. She walked past him to the porch railing where a small wooden box sat that she had set out that morning without explaining to Ruth or her father why. She had lined the box the night before with the same oilcloth from the attic. She picked up the box in both hands. She turned. She walked back to Silas Ashford and stood in front of him with the box held between them like an offering plate. She lifted the lid. Inside on the oilcloth lay 4 things: the tarnished bronze medal on the faded ribbon, the photograph of 2 young men in doughboy uniforms, one face slashed through with a hard diagonal pencil line, a letter folded 3 times written in a firm masculine hand on the thin paper of the war, and under all of them, folded once a single sheet of yellow legal foolscap, sealed with a smear of dark wax that had never been broken. She lifted the foolscap out first. She unfolded it slowly because she wanted him to see in the pause of her fingers that she knew what she held. Mr. Ashford, this is a receipt. It was written and signed on the 14th day of October in the year 1934 in the office of Wendell Curtis, attorney at law of this county, now deceased. It records that on that date my grandmother Cordelia Whitaker paid to your account at First Mercantile Bank the sum of $800 being the full principal of a promissory note signed by her late husband on the 14th day of September 1917, held by you. That $800 was earned dollar by patient dollar over 15 summers of rose sales at the county fair in nickels and quarters from farm wives across 3 counties, in the winter money she made from putting up her blackberry preserves in mason jars and driving them to town on the back of a wagon. That is where the money came from, Mr. Ashford. My grandmother sold her roses to pay a debt that a man too proud to accept his friend's kindness had let sleep for 16 years. It further records that all interest owing on the said note through the date of payment was waived by mutual agreement in consideration of prior services rendered by the borrower to the lender in the field in the month of October 1918. It is signed by my grandmother. It is signed by you. It is stamped by the notary. Wendell Curtis kept the second original in his files, and his daughter has kept his files, and I went to see her yesterday morning at her house on Elm Street. Would you like to read it, Mr. Ashford, or shall I read it aloud? His face went the color of skimmed milk, the same color it had gone at the fence in April. He did not take the paper. He stood in the yard with his empty hands still extended. Behind him, the assembled men had begun one by one to move a step closer. Cyrus Hollister, who had come with the last of the trucks in his own black sedan, took 2 long strides forward from the edge of the crowd until he stood at Ashford's shoulder. Edgar Pembroke stepped up on the other side. Alden Whitaker, without seeming to move, was suddenly at the foot of the blue steps, one hand on the newel post. Ruth Calloway held the coffee pot in both hands. Elowen did not raise her voice. I paid a call on Charlie Merck at the Veterans Hall last month, Mr. Ashford. He kept a photograph album. In his album, the picture is not damaged. In his album, I saw your face at 24, standing beside my grandfather 6 weeks before he was killed at Argonne. Charlie told me a story he had heard from a man named Buck Halloran. He said my grandfather pulled you out of a shell hole where you would have died. He said you never spoke of it after you came home. He said my grandmother wore black for the rest of her life for a man who saved yours. She set this foolscap back in the box. She lifted the letter. She unfolded it. The paper was so thin it caught the September light like a piece of onion skin. This is a letter my grandfather sent home to my grandmother in July of 18. It is the last letter she received from him. In it he writes, and I will quote you the line, because I have read it enough times now that I could recite it in my sleep. He writes, Della, if I do not come home to you, look to Silas Ashford. I lent him $300 from what your father gave us at the wedding so that he could send money to his people in Fort Wayne. He has promised repayment within the year. If I am gone, the debt is yours, but the man is honest, and he will not need a court to remember it. My grandfather lent you $300 in July of 1918. Mr. Ashford, Charlie Merck told me you paid that $300 back to my grandmother in the winter of 1919 in cash at her kitchen door. She never entered it in the ledger because she did not wish to shame you in front of anyone who might one day open her books. She was that kind of woman. But she remembered the debt going the other way, and she never let it go. My grandfather borrowed $800 from you in September of 1917. My grandfather lent you $300 in July of 1918. Two men going off to war helping each other with money in one direction and money in the other. That is a friendship, Mr. Ashford. That is not a mortgage. The crowd around the yard had gone completely quiet. Somewhere at the back, a wagon horse blew air through its nose. Silas Ashford's mouth had opened. He was breathing shallowly. Elowen folded the letter and laid it back in the box. My grandmother paid you $800 in 1934 out of the flour money she had saved a coin at a time because she was that kind of woman, and because she knew you would use the note against a Whitaker one day if she did not. You accepted her payment. You signed the receipt in Wendell Curtis's office. You kept the original promissory note in your safe anyway, because a man like you does not throw away a weapon just because he has agreed to sheath it. You waited 35 years. You waited until my grandmother was dead and I was alone. You had the note laid on my porch step in the middle of the night in April to see if I would fold. You bought my father's debt from the co-op in July to see if I would fold. You sent a man in the storm on the last night of July to cut down 42 of my trees with your own axe. Initials burned into the handle, and you gave yourself an alibi in the ballroom of the Anthony Hotel in Fort Wayne, so the sheriff could not touch you. And you have come here today in front of every farmer in Mercer County to collect on a debt that has been paid for 18 years from a woman whose roses paid it. Do I have the story right, Mr. Ashford, or have I left anything out? Silas Ashford did not answer. He could not answer. His face had gone from the color of skimmed milk to the color of ash, and something had begun to work at the corner of his mouth. That was not a word, was not a curse, was not even in the end a defense. I took one step back from the blue porch steps, then another. He looked at Cyrus Hollister at his shoulder. Hollister looked back at him with a face carved out of the same walnut that his desk was made of at First Mercantile, and Ashford must have seen in the banker's eyes what Elowen had seen in Bud Corliss's eyes back in August. The specific removal of an old man's protection, the small, clean quiet with which a certain kind of power decides that a man is no longer worth the trouble. At the back of the crowd, a heavy step came forward. A tall man in a canvas duster and a battered gray hat walked up through the parted trucks. He was thin, weather-beaten in his 50s. He carried his hat in his hand. Elowen did not know him. Sheriff Bud Corliss, who had ridden out that morning with Cyrus Hollister in the black sedan, because he had in the end decided he was tired of not being able to touch a man for the sake of an axe, came forward from the porch step where he had been leaning and put a hand on the tall stranger's shoulder. This is Elwood Craddock. He worked 7 years for Silas Ashford until 3 weeks ago when Ashford stopped paying his wages. He came to my office 2 nights ago of his own accord. He was in the passenger seat of the car that left the tractor path down at the fence line on the last night of July. He is prepared to swear who was driving. He is prepared to swear where they went afterward. He is prepared to swear who paid him $20 in cash the next morning to keep it quiet. I have taken his statement. I have a warrant in my pocket. Elowen closed the lid of the wooden box on the porch rail. She looked down at Silas Ashford in the yard. She spoke one last time in a voice that carried across the yard to the last man at the fence. My grandmother said one thing about you in my hearing, Mr. Ashford. Just one. She said, and I did not understand it at the time, that the worst kind of thief is the one who takes what he was already given because he cannot bear to have received it. I did not know what she meant. I do now. Bud Corliss took Silas Ashford by the elbow. He led him to the sheriff's car that had come down the lane behind the black sedan and had waited engine running at the edge of the yard. Cyrus Hollister put his hat back on his head. He did not look at any man in the crowd. He walked to his own car. He drove away up the lane behind the sheriff without speaking to anyone. Edgar Pembroke stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and did not move for a full minute after both cars had disappeared over the low-rise. The crowd broke slowly. Men shook their heads. Two of them wept openly, not for Ashford, but for the shape of a story they had not known was theirs. Alden Whitaker climbed the blue steps to the porch. He stopped one step below his daughter so that her head and his were for the first time in his memory level with each other. He put both his hands on her shoulders. He did not weep, but his voice when it came had the small quiet break in it of a man who has finally understood what he has always known. Elowen, I owe your grandmother an apology I cannot pay. I owe you one I mean to spend the rest of my life paying. I have been a fool for a long time. I would like to come home if the offer is still open. I would like to help you with what comes next. She put her forehead against his shoulder. She held him with her arms around his back. She did not answer with words because there were in that moment no words in her that would have been anything but small beside what he had just laid down. She held him until Ruth came up onto the porch with the coffee pot and put a hand on both of them, and then Elowen stepped back, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and turned to face the men who were still waiting in her yard. They stood in a loose crescent hats off now waiting to be told what came next. She did not for a moment know what to say to them. Then she looked at Pembroke. He nodded small. She looked at her father. He nodded small. She looked at Ruth. Ruth spoke quiet only for her ear. Speak to them, child. They came to hear you. Elowen came down the blue steps. She walked to the pasture gate. She turned. She lifted her voice so that the last man at the fence could hear her. I am not a farmer. I am 19 years old, and I have owned this land for 6 months. I do not know a great deal about anything, except that my grandmother knew what she was doing when she put a bundle of sticks in that attic for me to find. I am willing to teach you what she taught me, which is very little, but it is the little that has worked. The willow will grow where nothing else will grow. It will hold your creek banks. It will lift your water table. It will feed your soil back to you in 3 years' time. It will not save your corn this fall. Nothing will save your corn this fall, but it can save your farm for the corn you plant next spring, and the spring after that, and the spring your children will plant when we are gone. I have 500 cuttings soaking in my barn already. My father will take names. I will show every man here how to make his own before the frost. Nobody pays, nobody owes. My grandmother did not take money from her neighbors, and she would come out of her grave and take a switch to me if I started now. There is no witchcraft. There is no secret. There is only listening, and I do not even know all of what she listened for. I am learning. The crescent of men stood a moment longer. Then Joe Kowalski, whose eyes had filled when she had put a paper in his hand 2 weeks earlier, took a step forward, put his hat back on his head, took it off again as though he could not remember which he had meant to do, and spoke for all of them in a voice thick with the dust of 100 failed acres. Miss Whitaker, my daddy used to say that a man's word is the only crop that never fails him. Your grandmother had a word. You have a word. That is enough for the men here. Tell us where to stand. Tell us what to do. We are yours till you send us home. She sent them home an hour later with cuttings and instructions and a promise that she would come out to each place in turn over the next month to see the plantings in the ground. She stood at the fence and watched the line of trucks turn one by one out of the lane and back up the county road toward town. The wagons, alas, the mule-drawn one, moving at a walk that would take an hour to reach its own gate. She stood at the fence until the last of the dust had settled and only Ruth and Alden were left in the yard. Pembroke was still with them. He had not left. He came to the fence beside her. He looked out across the drowned land at the 450 stems of willow standing up in the September evening light at the ring of green ground cover under them that had turned the field into an island of life in the flat brown map of the county. He spoke without looking at her. There is something you should know. The state agricultural station in Purdue got wind of what is happening here last week. They telephoned my office at the courthouse yesterday. They want to send a team. They want to publish. They want to name a technique after your grandmother if I can produce enough documentation to satisfy them. You may produce whatever you like, Mr. Pembroke. It is not my grandmother's technique. It is my grandmother's listening. You cannot put listening in a bulletin, but you may try. I intend to. I am glad. Miss Whitaker, yes, there will be other counties. There will be other droughts. There will be a great many young women and a great many old ones whose grandmothers left them something in an attic that they do not know how to read. Would you consider in time going out to some of them? telling this story, teaching what you have taught here today. She thought about that. She looked out at her willows in the long, slow gold of the sun on the trunks. She thought about her grandmother, who had held on to 40 acres for 60 years so that a 19-year-old could one day stand on a porch step and put a paid receipt in a man's hand in front of his neighbors. Yes, Mr. Pembroke, I would consider that. In time. Pembroke nodded. He tipped his hat to her, tipped it to Ruth, tipped it to Alden. He walked to his own car up in the yard and drove away. Ruth left an hour later when the light was beginning to fail behind the sycamore, kissing Elowen once on the temple and squeezing her arm and saying only, "Your grandmother saw you coming, girl. All of it. She saw you coming." Then Ruth walked down the lane in her wide sun hat to her white clapboard house with the green shutters, and the lane was empty of everyone but Elowen and her father. Alden built a small fire in the parlor stove that evening, though it was not cold. He said the house had smelled damp all summer. He carried in a load of the split oak from the woodpile behind the barn, laid it in the crib beside the stove, filled the water bucket at the pump for the morning. He moved around the parlor with the careful quiet of a man who has come home to a place he is not yet certain has taken him back, and Elowen let him move because a man of his kind needed to earn his place with his hands before he could take it with his voice. They sat together on the porch after supper, both of them in the two rockers her grandmother had painted the same cornflower blue as the steps. The sun had gone. The whip-poor wills had begun in the sycamore. The willows down in the drowned land were a soft shadow against the last light in the west, a dark green fringe on the pale gray of the sky. Alden rocked slow. He did not speak for a long time. When he did not turn his head. "I have been trying to remember something all afternoon. When you were small, 4 or 5, your grandmother took you down to that field one day in April when it was flooded. I remember because I was standing on the porch with my mother's sister, your great aunt, and we watched the two of you go down there. Della carried you on her hip because your legs were too short for the mud. She stood you up on a piece of an old sycamore stump that used to be down there before it rotted out, and she pointed at the water and she said something to you. I could not hear it. I asked you when you came back and you said, and I remember it word for word because your aunt made a joke about it at the supper table. You said, Grandma said the ground has to be quiet before it can talk to you. You were 4 years old. You said that. I forgot it, girl. I forgot it for 15 years. Elowen kept rocking. She did not look at him either. I remember the stump, Pa. I don't remember what she said. You may not have needed to. You may have carried it in you without knowing. Maybe. The whip-poor wills went on. A single bat cut across the yard once and was gone. The last light behind the willows went from pearl to lavender to a deep, quiet blue that had no name for it in any language Elowen knew. She thought about the note in her grandmother's spidery hand. She thought about the metal in the tin box. She thought about the photograph which she had that morning before the trucks came taken out of the box and set gently in the parlor stove and touched with a match because the erased face was not owed to any living man, and the burning of it had been the last small business of the day she had been saving for herself. She thought about the willows standing in the drowned land. She thought about how much of what her grandmother had done had been done, not for a season, but for a granddaughter. She had never quite known she would have, not with certainty, only with the long, steady faith of a woman who plants trees she will not sit under. She thought about how a life had in the end been laid down for her in the shape of 40 acres and a bundle of sticks and a receipt kept for 18 years in a lawyer's file. She thought about how the smallest kinds of courage done by the quietest kind of woman in the quietest kind of way can outlast the loudest kinds of men. She rocked in the blue chair. Her father rocked beside her. The night came on soft. In the drowned land somewhere down among the green shadow of the willows, a single frog began to sing the first frog she had heard in that field in her life. Another answered from further away. A third joined them. She listened. She let herself listen the way her grandmother had once on a piece of stump in a flooded April taught her to listen when she was too small to know she was learning. She spoke at last without turning her head more to the night than to her father, the last small line of a story that had in the end belonged to a woman she would never again see in this world. My grandmother did not know it the way people mean when they say knowing. She knew it because she listened, and the ground answered her. It answered her Pa. It just took a long time to answer loud enough for the rest of us to hear. Alden did not speak. He put his hand across the arm of her rocker. She put hers on top of it. They sat that way for a long time, in the two blue chairs on the porch of the sagging house, with the newly patched roof, listening to the frogs, listening to the whip-poor wills, listening to the small far-off rustle of a September wind, moving through 450 willows, in a field that had been at the beginning of a year, nothing but drowned land. Is where the story ends. Not with a harvest because it was too late in the year for a harvest. Not with a wedding or a windfall or a court of law finding for the innocent. Though a court would in the following March find against Silas Ashford on 3 counts and strip him of most of what he had gathered in 60 years of gathering. It ends with a girl on a porch and her father beside her and a grandmother's voice in the ground and the small, honest sound of frogs coming back to a piece of land that had been given at last what it had always been owed.